This here is our back piece. Before we dive into cutting it out, there's a few things I want to point out. First of all is that almost all fabrics have a so-called good and bad side, even though good and bad is really more what people think of it. This fabric has that too, in the sense that both sides look slightly different. You can pick whichever side you prefer, but you should be consistent. Like, don't make the back out of one side of the fabric and the front out of another, because that will look bad. Most knitwear has one side where it's easier to see the grain, and I typically treat that as the bad side because the other side has a more homogeneous look. Sometimes if there's a print, it's obviously easy to see which side the designer intended to be the quote-unquote good side. But in this case, for me, the good side is here. So we're going to be cutting out this back part, and we're cutting it so-called on the fold, excuse me. So on the fold means that we're going to fold our fabric double and then cut half of the pattern part. So as you can see, this front is symmetric. We fold it like this, and we have the complete front. So this is how we save space when designing patterns. We save space in paper and just tell you to cut it on the fold. So when you do that, you cut something with good sides together. So that means that the good side of the fabric should be folded together. So this is the bad side, this is the good side. Please make sure to keep your fabric on grain, which means that the lines in which the fabric are created should be parallel to this fold line, so that your garment and the fabric sort of have the same layout. And you will often find in t-shirts that you buy in the store that after a while this t-shirt starts to take on a different shape, and that's typically because it was created with fabric that was slightly off grain. Knitwear can be a little bit finicky. It tends to roll up like that on the side, so be careful for that. Once we're done, we can get to cutting. Now a lot of people will include the seam allowance in their pattern. I never do that. I cut out the pattern as it is without seam allowance, and then add the seam allowance as I'm cutting out the different pattern parts. The reason I do that is because on a woven, which is like a non-knit material, like jeans or cotton, I prefer to mark the actual line on which we later have to sew, which allows us to work more precisely, and then just add the seam allowance later. On knitwear, it is really difficult to mark. On knitwear, the reasons for doing so is that it becomes quite difficult to mark, because as you mark, knitwear has the tendency, because it stretches, to sort of bunch up, and it makes it difficult to draw a clean line. So what I usually do is I mark the hem allowance, for which I use 3 times the seam allowance. Seam allowance for me is 1 centimeter, so the hem allowance 3 centimeter. And the rest of the seam allowance, I just eyeball 1 centimeter and cut it out like that. So I'm going to be starting here with the hem allowance, which is marked, and then as we get here, I'm just going to go around all along, or I could start here, and I stay 1 centimeter from the edge of my pattern, which is where the actual sewing needs to happen, like this. This is just a weight to keep the pattern in place. It serves no other purpose. There we are. Our front is cut out. So once again, we cut this on the fold. So our entire pattern piece looks like this. We're going to do the same now for the back.